So I think we'll start, and we are happy to host Balázs Szigeti.
Very good.
Today. So let's see. Balázs started, as you told me, in physics, I think in Imperial.
Correct.
Then went for a Ph.D. in Edinburgh. And well, you've been in a few different places, right? You were at the in the Econ Institute of Genetics in New York, and then in 2016 you saw the light of psychedelics, and you, in collaboration with the Global Drug Survey, right? You showed that neuroimaging studies overestimate the harm of recreational MDMA use. And you also invented, I believe, the self-binding, a novel methodology that I hope you're going to tell us a little bit about today, that enables self-experimenters to incorporate placebo into their experiments. And I think right now you're investigating the intersection of placebo and psychedelics back in Imperial. So without further ado, please, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for coming out. Okay, so I will tell you about two studies that we have conducted over the past few years. And one of them is going to be the self-blinding microdose trial that Yuri has mentioned. And then the second one is going to be a new preprint, so it's not through peer review yet. And these two studies are very much interlinked because the second study is going to reanalyze data from the first study. And intellectually, the two are really continuous, because one of the issues that we have noticed in the first study is that blinding was weak, meaning that participants were able to deduce their drug conditions. So the study wasn't really placebo, wasn't really double blind, to be more correct. And we have developed a way of dealing with that. Now, in this talk, I will use this microdose trial data often, but note that what I will actually talk about is much broader than microdosing or just psychedelics, really. What I will actually talk about is the strange situation that in medical research, we consider the blinded placebo-controlled studies as the gold standard of evidence, yet practically nobody checks whether the blinding really worked in most trials, whether patients were genuinely unaware of their drug condition, or if side effects and or other factors gave away the drug condition. Previously, it has been estimated that only about 2 to 7% of trials are checking blinding integrity. And when blinding integrity is checked, it's found to be weak for about 50% of the cases. So I think what I talk about potentially has a wide-ranging impact. Now, before we get on and talk about the self-blinding microdose trial, I would just like to clarify the difference between what I'm going to call macrodosing and microdosing. So if you're reading about psychedelics, which are obviously generating a lot of hype nowadays, very likely you are hearing about results with respect to macrodosing. And macrodosing is this therapeutic approach where it's basically a classic talk therapy, but in that talk therapy, there is 1 or 2 large doses of psychedelic drug sessions embedded. So the point is that what's generating a lot of positive results about psychedelics is this Macrodose model, which is basically a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, where there's a classic psychotherapy, and within that, there is 1 or 2 relatively large doses of psychedelics, where by large doses, I mean something around 25 milligrams of psilocybin or 1 to 200 micrograms of LSD. Now, in contrast with that, I will talk about microdosing in this study, which is this new mode of using psychedelics, which came about in the 2010s. Most prominently, it came to the light with the work of a guy called Jim Fadiman, who is active in the Bay Area, and it's really picked up since the mid-2010s when microdosing has become a hype phenomenon. Okay, so that's the difference between micro and macrodosing, and just please bear in mind that I will talk about microdosing in this talk. So what is this self-blinding, this methodology that we developed? So self-blinding is a novel methodology that we have developed at Imperial, and it is basically a setup procedure that enables citizen scientists to set up their own placebo control without clinical supervision. So really the idea is that participants are going to hide their microdoses inside non-transparent gel capsules, and then they can use empty capsules as placebos. And then I'm skipping a lot of the steps here. I just want to give you the high-level overview. But then each of these capsules is associated with a QR code. All of the capsules are mixed together. You randomly select one, you scan the QR code that linked with the IT infrastructure of our system. And that enabled us to track who is taking what capsule type at what time point. So again, briefly, the point here is that this allowed us to run a large-scale placebo-controlled study of psychedelics, but a fraction of the logistic and economic cost of a typical clinical trial. So I don't have the time to go into all of the details now, but this work is now published. It was published in eLife last March. So if you're interested in the details, you can read it out there. Also, we are right now expanding our IT infrastructure around self-blinding. So if you think that self-blinding meshes well with your favorite intervention, we are very happy to help you setting up your own self-blinding study and use this IT infrastructure that enables self-blinding trials to run. So the self-blinding trial, as I said, this is not really a clinical science, not really a clinical trial. This is rather what we call like a citizen science trial, and that has its own pros and cons. And really the big negative when it comes to this particular trial is that participants have sourced their own drugs. So there was no, they had to source it from the black market because psychedelics are illegal in most countries. However, I would say that this is actually by and large a part of the whole world of microdosing. Microdosings are illegal practically everywhere. So, you know, sort of the way people are microdosing, inherently there is a lot of question marks with respect to the purity of the substance and the exact dosage that was used. So it's not like that everybody is microdosing with legal psychedelics, but in our study, they have sourced it from the black market. No, sourcing psychedelics from the black market is inherently the part of the world of microdosing. So that is about the downsides of self-blinding, but I think there is a lot of positives about it. And first and foremost is that the entire experiment is running on the internet, so you can recruit participants globally, increasing your sample size. So this study was completed by 191 participants, making it easily the largest placebo-controlled study on psychedelics. And not only it was the largest placebo-controlled study on psychedelics, but it was also one of the cheapest ones. So this study has costed us somewhere around 10 to 15,000 US dollars. And as you will know, that's practically nothing when it comes to research costs. So even though participants have used their own drugs sourced from the black market, but on the plus side, we have managed to recruit this very, very large sample with placebo control and really at a cheap cost. And that's really where the value of self-blinding is. If we are stepping back and just trying to understand this methodology, the way I like to think about it is that classically, when we are thinking about the evidence pyramid, we are thinking about the well-controlled clinical studies are somewhere up in the evidence pyramid. And then below that are the observational studies that are not controlled and are considered weak evidence. And really, classically, there is nothing really in between these two study categories. You're either running an observational study or you're running a clinical trial. And I feel that this self-blinding, it fills this gap a little bit because it has elements of both. It has elements of the observational studies in the sense that this is almost like a non-interventional study. Like we never met with the participants, we never gave them anything. They just prepared their own placebo control. However, it has that element from the clinical trials that it has the placebo control. Previously, if I would have told you that, hey, we are running a placebo-controlled trial, everybody would be thinking about a clinical trial because that's the only study type where placebo control makes sense. But with the self-blinding methodology, we showed that actually it is possible to run placebo-controlled trials outside of a classic clinical trial. And last but not the least, just talking about the pros, and this is a bit more of a tangential point, but I think this is also worthy to mention that a study like this has much higher external validity than clinical trials. And by external validity, I mean that here the results are much more likely to transfer into real-life efficacy compared to a clinical trial, which are often very well controlled, but they often control away that real-life context. Here, people microdosed with placebo control going on about their everyday life. So the effects of microdosing were studied in that real-life context, not in that very artificial clinical trial context. And I think that is also an important point to raise, that yes, this was less well controlled than a clinical trial, but it also has the advantages that the outcomes that we have observed here are much closer to what we should expect in that real life context rather than in a strictly controlled clinical context. So next, I just want to tell you a little bit about the structure of the trial so you understand what I talk about later on. And first, please just look at the timeline at the top. So we had the baseline measures at week 0, and then there was this dose regime for 4 weeks. The primary endpoint was at week 5, and then we also had a long-term follow-up at week 9. So the big question, obviously, is that what did they do during that dose regime? And part of that self-blinding setup procedure, participants were randomized into one of 3 groups. And first, let's just look at the placebo group. And that's where you only see the blue capsules, which stands for the empty placebo capsules. So this is an easy group to understand. People just did placebos for the entire 4 weeks. Now, on the other end, we have the microdose group. And in this case, participants were microdosing for 4 weeks. And notice that there is some oddity here, and by that I mean is that participants in the microdose group also took some placebo capsules. There are some blue capsules mixed in with the red capsules, where the red capsule stands for a microdose capsule and the blue one stands for the placebo capsule. And this was originally like one of the restrictions of the self-blinding methodology, but actually later on we realized that this is a really cool study feature, that not all of the capsules are the same, because it meant that it's going to strengthen blinding a little bit. It's going to keep participants more uncertain about the drug that they are taking. Notice that in this microdose condition, participants have taken 2 microdoses per week. This is fairly typical of what people are calling microdosing. Before we actually ran this study, we made a small pilot with 9, or I think it was 10 experienced microdosers who have selected a lot of the parameters or have selected these parameters in terms of like the dosing level. They have suggested to us that 2 microdoses per week is how most people are microdosing. Last but not the least, in the middle, we have what we call the half-half group. And this group was microdosing for 2 weeks, that is week 1 and week 3, and was taking placebos for week 2 and week 4. And obviously, we set up the experiment in this manner because we were interested to see if there is a dose-response relationship between these 3 conditions. Next, I would like to talk about that blue frame that you, oh, sorry, green. Oops, where is the laser pointer? No, that's not it. Yeah. So this green frame here, and this is what we call the acute outcomes. And the way these work is that participants always took their capsules in the morning, and then 2 to 6 hours later, we measured what we call the acute outcomes. So what are the effects of microdosing while the drug is still active in a pharmacological sense? And then this purplish frame that you see here, that's what we call the post-acute outcome. And that is basically the day after your microdose. First, what I would like to talk about is what we call in the paper the accumulative outcome. And that is going to be the change from baseline to week 5. And the primary outcome was a well-being measure. We chose well-being as the primary outcome, again, because that's what microdosers have suggested. And also because we expected that the population that we are going to get into this study is going to be a non-clinical population. And by that I mean is that most people will not have a clinical diagnosis of depression and anxiety. By and large, the sample is healthy. And that's why we chose well-being as the primary outcome. So this is the RIF psychological well-being scale. That's what RPWB stands for. And as I said, this is the well-being scale that was the primary outcome of the trial. And then what I would like to focus on is, again, this change from baseline, which we call pre-regime on this figure, to post-regime, which is basically after that 4 weeks long dosing regime. First, let's focus just on the red line, which is represents the microdose group. And what is important to notice here is that there was actually a statistically significant increase from baseline to the end of the dosing regime. And in a way that validates a lot of the anecdotes about microdosing. Participants really did better after 4 weeks of microdosing. However, where the story is going to get a lot more interesting is when we add in the blue line into the picture, which stands for the placebo group, because the placebo group also improved. And if you make the between groups comparison, that is non-significant anymore. So yes, the microdose group did improve on this well-being measure from baseline to the primary endpoint, but so did the placebo control group. And there was no statistically significant between groups difference, which suggests that people in the placebo and in the microdose group have improved equally. Now with green here, we have that half-half group. And like on this particular outcome, these are like very nicely ordered, that the placebo group improved the least, then the half-half group, and then the microdose group. I'll show you a bunch of other outcomes in the next slide, and there is not going to be so nicely ordered. But you can see something that resembles the dose-response relationship on this figure. I think that's a false positive because you don't see this on the some of the other outcomes. But nonetheless, here the half-half group landed in the middle. Moving on to the other outcomes, I would just like to say that, again, these outcomes, not just the primary outcome, but all of the other outcomes that you see on this figure were selected by microdosers. So we worked very closely with microdosers setting up this study, and we asked their advice in what are some of the variables, what are the questionnaires that we should focus on with this study to capture the positive effects of microdosing. So if you look at mindfulness, it is qualitatively the same story as with well-being. This well-being is the same as from the previous slide. When it comes to this mindfulness measure, qualitatively the same story. If you just focus on the microdose group alone, there is a statistically significant increase. But again, the placebo group also improved, and there is no significant between groups differences, suggesting that mindfulness improved equally under the placebo and the microdose condition. I'm gonna not talk about the long-term follow-ups much in this talk, and that is because there is not gonna be any significant between group differences between placebo and microdose on any of the outcomes, so that it would be just weird to talk about whether that effect was sustained, given that there was no effect to begin with. Life satisfaction, again, same story, statistically significant increase in the microdose group, but the placebo group also improved, and no between conditions difference. Paranoia, same story. With paranoia, you want less, so that's why the plot is going downwards, but that is a positive outcome in this case. And then actually the outcome that behaved qualitatively differently than the others is this cognition, the CPS, where the CPS stands for cognitive performance score. Now, this is my favorite outcome in the trial. And the reason why is because all of the other outcomes were based on self-reported outcomes. So all of the other ones were questionnaires, while the CPS, the cognitive, that was like a proper computerized cognitive performance measurement. So the way this worked is that we have selected 6 cognitive tasks from the library of a company that we worked with. The tasks were mental rotation test. There was a memory card task. There was an odd one out test, and I'm not going to remember the other 3. You can look it up in the paper if you remember. But basically, the CPS scores, it's a combination, it's an aggregate score across all of those 6 tasks that covered a wide range of cognitive domains. Now, I told you that the CPS behaves differently than the other outcomes. How so? So here, the microdose group does not improve significantly relative to the baseline. And that is interesting because for all of the self-reported outcomes, the microdose group do improve across time, but not in this case. And when I first plotted it, that's when, it sort of like really hit me, that it could be a placebo effect. Because with the cognitive performance score, which is a more objective outcome than the self-reported outcomes, you would expect there to be a much smaller placebo response. It is well established in the placebo literature that the placebo effects are much stronger with subjective outcomes such as well-being, mindfulness, or life satisfaction, rather than the cognitive performance, which is a much more objective measure because it is run via a computer test. What I don't show you here is that we also measure the big 5 personality traits. And again, there was no any significant between group differences. Openness was the one, but there was like a trend between placebo and the microdose conditions. I think the p-value was 0.008, something like that. And that sort of makes sense because openness, increased openness has been linked with psychedelic macrodosing. So again, with the large dose therapies. So what do we make of these results? And I think there are 2 important observations here. And then one of them is that microdosing consistently increased a number of psychological parameters. And again, that validates this anecdotal evidence about microdosing, that it can have some positive effects. But we also see that it doesn't improve more, statistically speaking, than a placebo would. So what these results suggest is that the improvements experienced by the microdose group are not due to the pharmacological activity of the microdosing, rather psychological expectation effects are sufficient to reproduce these because the placebo group improved equally as the microdose group. So as I said, this is what we called in the paper the accumulative outcome. So this is the change from baseline to the primary endpoint. But if you remember, I also told you that we had like some other outcomes as well, these acute and post-acute outcomes. And that's what I would like to discuss next. So this table is from the paper. And in this first analysis, what I am showing you is that what are the results if you're doing a very traditional statistical analysis of the data. And by traditional analysis, I mean that you do not consider blinding integrity in any shape or form. And in this case, as you can see here, that there were a few variables that have statistically significant placebo versus microdose differences, although with a fairly small effect size. So Cohen's d is a standard measure of effect size, and typically if Cohen's d is around 0.3, that's what you call a small effect, and around 0.5, that's when you start to call it a moderate effect. The point being is that, as you can see that here, like nothing is actually even hitting 0.3. So these effects are statistically significant, but they are fairly small. So what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to start to transition into that second paper that I have mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So we're going to take this data and reanalyze it in a way that incorporates the blinding integrity data into the analysis. So what is cool about these acute outcomes in this study is that at the end of every day where participants took a capsule, they also had to respond to a question that was, hey, do you think that in the morning, do you take a placebo or a microdose capsule? So they had to take a guess regarding their drug condition. Now, it turns out that such guess data is critical because this allows you to check for blinding integrity. If participants are effectively blinded and they are just guessing randomly, then you would expect them to get this guess right about 50% of the time. However, what we have found in this study is that they got it right about 72% of the time, which is significantly higher than the 50% that you would expect if participants are guessing randomly. Let me add quickly that the high correct guess rate, the 72%, has nothing to do with that funky self-blinding process that I was telling you about earlier. And I feel confident claiming that because other sort of like classic clinical trials that examine microdosing since also had a correct guess rate about 70%. So the 70% correct guess rate, it seems to be universal for microdosing across trials. And also, I would just like to quickly add that it is also fairly representative of more traditional psychopharmacological interventions, such as SSRIs. Now, traditionally, if you're running a trial and you notice that blinding is weak in your trial, then most trial teams don't do anything. The best case scenario is that in the discussion of their upcoming manuscript, they're going to say a sentence or two that blinding was weak, and future trials should aim to improve blinding when examining this intervention. However, they don't really tell you typically that how to improve blinding. It's not an obvious problem. And the other issue with this statement is that it's sort of like it does not integrate with how then the trial is analyzed. There is very little effort in the literature to integrate blinding integrity information into the interpretation of the trial. Typically, what they do is that they just give you the results analyzed traditionally. Again, by traditional analysis, I mean without considering blinding integrity. And they mention, oh, and by the way, this study wasn't really double-blinded. We know that from the guess data because participants have guessed their drug condition correctly at a rate much higher than chance. So that's the situation. And I think that is actually bad science. And the reason for that is because we don't do placebo control just so that your statistician can make a between condition difference. We do placebo control in these trials so that we can eliminate subjective expectancy biases. And if you don't care about blinding integrity, if you don't check the correct guess rate, then the same expectancy biases can find their way back into your trial via a mechanism that I am going to call activated expectancy bias. But before I go there, I realized that I forgot to say one more thing regarding the blinding assessment, or rather the lack of blinding assessment in clinical trials. And I think this is important to discuss that. So why is it that traditionally clinical trials assess blinding integrity very rarely? As I've mentioned in the introduction of my talk, only about 2 to 7% of trials assess blinding integrity. And I think there are three important reasons for that. One of them is that there is no standard assessment tool. So even if you're interested or would be interested in this correct guess rate in your trial, there are multiple ways that you can go about it. So for example, in our study, it was a forced binary choice. You needed to guess from two options, either a placebo or a microdose. But some studies add in a third option, which is the I don't know. Or some other assessments just have the active or the placebo guess, but also have a confidence interval associated with that guess. The point being is that there is no standard assessment tool, and because of that, that leads to uncertainty, and that's why many trial teams end up dropping it. The second reason why blinding assessment is rare is because even if you assess blinding, there is no standardized pipeline how to integrate that information into your trial results. So as I said, typically what most trial teams do is that they may discuss blinding integrity in their manuscript, but it's very rarely integrated into the actual results. And the third factor why blinding assessment is rare, and this is probably the most important reason, is the fear of weakening results. Because with this correct guess rate data, you can actually check whether your blinding worked or not. So very often what would come out when blinding integrity is checked, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, when blinding integrity is checked, it is found to be weak for about 50% of the case. So that means that the study wasn't really placebo blinded, which means that then actually the study really it should be considered at a lower level in that hierarchy of evidence. And in particular, if you're a pharmacological company who is putting millions of dollars into developing a new drug, you want to make sure that there is going to be a return on that investment. And if you would check the blinding integrity in your trial, that would create a higher standard of what actually placebo control is. And I think that's why it is so rare that we are seeing blinding integrity. most trials are sponsored by a company, and companies want to make sure that there are going to be positive results. At least they want to maximize the chance of seeing positive results. Nonetheless, right now I talk to a scientific audience where, hopefully there are better motives to actually get to the bottom of it. Okay, so as I have mentioned before, is that if you don't check your trial for blinding integrity, then subjective expectancy biases can find their way back into your trial results via a mechanism I'm calling activated expectancy. So what is this activated expectancy? So this is from our upcoming paper. This is, you can access a preprint now. It's not through peer review yet. We are about to submit it, but you can read the paper here. And a part of this paper is that we have built the computational model of this activated expectancy. And this is the diagram representing that model. And the main point here is that you are going to see you have two pathways on this graph. So you have here with blue the direct treatment effect, which is where traditionally you would like your therapeutic efficacy to be. But there is this other red pathway, which I am calling activated expectancy. And really the key arrow here is this one here between treatment and perceived treatments. And we know from data that there needs to be an arrow here, because the correct guess rate in most trials is much higher than chance. So we know that there is a relationship between treatment and perceived treatment. And then really the main idea behind activated expectancy is that once side effects and or some other factors allowed you to break the blind to reduce your drug condition, then treatment expectations are going to affect the outcomes exactly the same way as they would affect the outcome in a non-blinded study, such as in a single-arm open-label drug administration study. Now, one more important to note here is that, so as I said before, we know that there needs to be an arrow here because the correct guess rate is much higher than chance. But note that you could draw this diagram in another way as well, where there is an arrow between outcome and perceived treatment. And practically the situation would correspond to the situation that you're enrolled in a placebo-controlled trial. Let's say that it's a depression trial. You take the medicine and your depression symptoms improve so much that you deduce that, hey, I must be in the active intervention group because there is no other explanation for the level of improvement that I am experiencing. I'm going to come back to that issue in a second, but I'm going to just sort of like pretend that this is the correct diagram for the time being. So what I have promised you earlier at the introduction of my talk is a method that can adjust trial results for blinding integrity. So how that is going to look like. And in a minute, I'm going to show you a bunch of figures that I'm going to call correct guess rate curves. And what these correct guess rate curves are going to are an estimate of the trial outcomes as a function of the correct guess rate. And what I am going to do is that take this model and analyze it in under 4 model cases, where the 4 model cases is that I'm taking both of these pathways, the activated expectancy, so the red pathway, and the direct treatment effect pathway, so the blue one, and turn them either on or off. So we have 2 binary variables, or like 2 pathways, both of them can be turned on or off, resulting in 2 times 2, 4 cases of the model. But importantly, on the next slide, I am going to show you these correct guess rate curves when it is applied to data generated from this model. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you synthetic model data, but then I'm going to show you the results, those correct guess rate curves for real life data on microdosing. Okay, let's see. Okay. So these are these correct guess rate curves that I've mentioned earlier. And I know these figures are fairly busy So first, let me just walk you through it. So here at the x-axis, what you have is the correct guess rate. And these figures have 2 y-axes. So with blue here, I am showing you the treatment p-value, and on the other side is the scale for the treatment estimate. So this is the p-value associated with the placebo microdose difference, and then with red you see the associated treatment estimate. Or sorry, here I said that the p-value associated with microdose placebo difference, but again, bear in mind that this is just synthetic data at this point. The microdose data is going to be on the next slide. So what you see here at the top, this is the model case. So DTE stands for the direct treatment effect, and AEB is for the activated expectancy bias. And in this case, both of them are turned off. So if I go back to these figures, like basically none of these arrows should be in the diagram, and we are just looking at treatment and outcome that are two random variables in this case. And the technique, the correct guess rate, gives you the correct answer. You can see that the p-value is just hovering around 0.5 in the entire correct guess rate range. And you can see that the treatment effect is also hovering around 0, which is again correct because we know that there is no relationship in this case between treatment and outcome. Oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce these dashed lines. So let me actually go back to that. Apologies, I should have said that before. So this horizontal sort of like purplish dashed line, that is just drawn at the p-value of 0.005. So this is the traditional threshold for statistical significance. The green vertical line here, that is the correct guess rate, that is drawn at the correct guess rate of 70%, which is again representative of both microdosing and both SSRI treatments. And we also set up the model that the inherent correct guess rate is somewhere around 70%. And last but not the least, this black dashed line that is drawn at the correct guess rate of 50%, which is what you would get if your study would be properly blinded. So this is sort of like the empirical correct guess rate, and this is what is the this is what corresponds to an effectively blinded trial. So moving on to the next model case, in this case, the direct treatment effect is on, but there is no activated expectancy. So that's how psychopharmacology is supposed to work, that there is this blue arrow here, but none of the red arrows exist in the following case. And as you can see, the green line, so the treatment p-value that stays below the significant threshold in the entire correct guess rate range, which is correct because in this case, the direct treatment effect is on. So we know that there is a relationship between treatment and outcomes. And also the effect size is giving a correct estimate because this is synthetic data. I know that the value should be around 10, and indeed it is hovering around 10 again in the entire correct guess rate range. Now, let's get to the interesting cases which are here at the bottom. So in this third case, there is no direct treatment effect. So the treatment is completely ineffective. However, there is an activated expectancy bias. And in this case, what's really, really cool is that if you look at the green line, you can see that it intersects the blue line below the significance threshold. Now remember that this green line, the green dashed vertical line, is drawn at a correct guess rate of about 70%, which is the guess rate in this model. And if you would analyze your data traditionally, that is without regarding blinding integrity, then you would conclude that, hey, there is a treatment effect because the p-value and the green line intersects here. However, very importantly, if you look at where the black line, which is again drawn at the correct guess rate of 50% intersects the blue line, that is at much, much higher at the p-value about 0.5, meaning that in this case, there is no significant treatment difference. So what this suggests is that what you would get from the traditional analysis, that is actually a false positive result, which is just an artifact driven by the weak blinding in your trial. Now, this last case, that is when both there is a direct treatment effect and an activated expectancy. And in this case, again, the model tells you that there is a direct treatment effect in the entire correct guess rate range, which is again correct because the direct treatment effect pathway is turned on. However, notice that the estimated treatment effect sharply drops between the green dashed line and the black dashed line. So in this case, what the algorithm does is that it basically subtracts the effect of activated expectancy from the overall estimate of the treatment effect, and it gives the correct estimate of the active versus placebo difference. So in this case, I know that in the model, the treatment effect is set about to be 10. But note that if I would not make this correct gas rate adjustment, then the estimate of the treatment effect would be about 13 points on this artificial scale. Without the correct gas rate adjustment, a traditional analysis overestimates the effect size by about 30%, which is obviously something that you should care about. So again, this is just the synthetic data that I have derived from the model that I have shown you on the previous slide. So how do these correct gas rates look on real life data? So first, let me just talk about this one up here in the upper left corner, the PANAS, the emotional state measure, where PANAS stands for positive and negative affection scale. It is a widely used psychological assessment. And again, what we see is that if you look at the green dashed line, then you would conclude that, hey, there is a statistically significant microdose placebo difference. However, if you do this correct gas rate curve, you can see that if the study would be properly blinded at a correct gas rate of 0.5, then there would be no statistically significant difference between placebo and microdose. So what this suggests is that in traditional analysis, we saw a difference, but it's likely to be a false positive driven by activated expectancy bias. So PANAS is one of the outcomes in this trial. What about some of the other ones? And qualitatively, the mood VAS, where the VAS stands for visual analog scale, it's exactly the same story. Creativity, again, another often claimed benefit of microdosing, exactly the same story. There is a benefit if you don't consider blinding integrity, but once blinding integrity is considered, the effect is completely gone. So what about energy VES? That's not exactly the same story as the previous ones, because here, even after this correct gas rate adjustment, the effect remains significant, although with a much smaller effect size. So with the energy VAS, without the correct gas rate adjustment, the estimated effect size in terms of Cohen's d was just below 0.5, so it was like a moderate effect. But after the correct gas rate adjustment, it goes back to 0.31, so it is a small effect. So if you don't consider the correct gas rate, then you would overestimate the effect size of self-perceived energy. So what this actually means, this energy VS, is that I actually do believe that microdosing does have a true effect on self-perceived energy levels, although with a small effect size. I'm not familiar with the caffeine literature, but I talked recently to a few people, and that effect size of Cohen's d about 0.3, that is roughly equivalent of having an espresso. So microdosing may have an effect, which is something like having an espresso that is not explainable by expectancy effects. This well-being scale, this is a different well-being scale than what I showed you before. So this is actually acute well-being, while previously what I have showed you is the change in well-being over a 4 weeks long dosing period. But the acute well-being scale is this Web's, the Warwick-Edinburgh well-being measure. Note that this wasn't significant even before the correct gas rate adjustment, and it's even less significant after it. I'm just showing you that like it qualitatively has the same feature as the correct gas rate curves in the top row. And then last but not the least, here is again the cognitive performance score, my favorite outcome in the study. And again, you can see that this is basically a flat line here in the entire correct gas rate range. And the explanation for that is very similar to what I gave you when I showed you the accumulative cognitive performance score outcomes, that it makes sense that for cognitive performance, expectations are going to have a minimal effect because it is a much more objective outcome rather than all of the other self-reported outcomes. So we reanalyze in this preprint all of the acute outcomes in the microdose trial, and really this energy visual analog scale, that's the only outcome that remains significant after this correct gas rate adjustment. So in a way, we have butchered our own results, but I think that's good science. So I'm quite happy with how it turned out to be. So at this point, hope you see the value of these figures, and not just for their aesthetic value, but see the scientific value as well. But the natural question is that, okay, but how did you construct these? And I'm not going to go into all of the technical details, but I want to give you a bird's eye view of this adjustment method. So I am going to consider a trial which is just, so I'm going to consider data which is completely synthetic. So this doesn't have any real life relevance. This is just for illustrative purposes. But let's say that we have a trial with 100 participants where the correct gas rate is 70%, again, fairly typical of real life data. And then what the algorithm does is that it takes the gas data from participants and it dissects the top distribution into two sub-distributions, the correct gas and the incorrect gas sub-distribution. In the correct gas sub-distribution are the people who have taken a placebo capsule and who have guessed the placebo, and people who have taken a microdose and thought it was a microdose. Now note that the n, so the sample size in these two sub-distributions are 70 and 30 respectively, which is going to correspond to a total sample of 100 participants with a correct gas rate of 0.7. So once we have these two sub-distributions, we are fitting a statistical model to both of these sub-distributions using a simple kernel density estimate method. And then finally, in order to obtain an estimate of the outcome if the trial would be well blinded, what we do is that we just take both of these distributions and then draw 50-50 random samples. And what that is going to result in is this pseudo-experimental data set that it is going to have n equal 100, just like the original data, but crucially a correct gas rate of about 0.5, which again corresponds to a well-blinded study. Now, this last step is repeated 100 times, and then what I was actually showing you in the previous slide, that is the average p-value and the average estimated treatment effect across those 100 runs. And we take this, we repeat this step 100 times just so that we reduce the influence of each individual random samples. So I told you how you can obtain an estimate of the outcomes at the correct gas rate of 0.5. And you can just basically do the same method to obtain or estimate the outcomes for other correct gas rate values. So for example, if I'm interested, what are the outcomes here where the correct gas rate are 0.8, then I am just basically taking 80 samples from the correct gas rate distribution and 20 samples from the incorrect gas sub-distribution. Again, that is going to get me a sample of 100 participants with a correct gas rate of 0.8. And I'm just repeating the steps 100 times, calculating the average p-value, average treatment estimate. And that's how these curves are constructed. Okay. Yeah. Oops, sorry, that one too many. Okay, so where do these results leave us with respect to the efficacy of microdosing? And in particular, I want to talk about the claimed mood benefits of microdosing. And I think there are two critical observations. And one of them is that microdosing definitely does something, because we know that the correct gas rate is much higher than chance, which suggests that microdosing does have some true effects. There must be, otherwise, how come that participants can reliably distinguish microdosing from placebo? But the other important observation here is that none of the benefits would remain significant if the trial would be properly blinded. So then the concept that comes to mind is that of active placebo, which is an intervention that has no robust direct benefit, but that nonetheless has some recognizable effects. And if you're looking at microdosing from this perspective, I think that explains a lot of both of the anecdotal benefits and the negative results from clinical trials. I mean, typically microdosers tend to be a very enthusiastic crowd. After all, microdosing is not something that your doctor is going to prescribe to you. And people who want to microdose, they have to go through some trouble. Like, first of all, they have to, make some contact with the black market and source their drug from there. And it also takes quite a bit of effort to portion out these psychedelics. And I don't think many people would go through these steps unless they would have some positive expectations about the effects. And then, they take the microdoses, and then, the microdosing, as I said, does something which they can feel. And we asked them that, what were the factors that allowed you to break the blind? When you were guessing a microdose, what was it that made you guess the microdose? And very often what people have reported is what is known as body load in the psychedelic literature. So muscle tension, stomach discomfort, a slightly jittering feeling, as if you would have too much caffeine, something like that. And these effects are very common with the large doses of psychedelics. But here, because the doses are much smaller, obviously the intensity of those experiences are much smaller. Nonetheless, they are significant enough, or they are perceivable enough so that microdosers can feel it, explaining why the break blind rate is high in these studies. So remember that when I was at this figure, I have promised you that I am going to come back to this question, that why is it that the side effects are giving away the perceived treatment and not the outcomes? And I think, that is something that you would need to examine, sort of like for each of the interventions when you're interested in running this correct gas rate analysis. And in a second, I'm going to talk about an assessment tool. But specifically when it comes to microdosing, I have two strong reasons why this is the correct diagram and why there is no arrow between outcome and perceived treatment. And the first argument is that, as I just told you, we asked participants that what was the critical cue that allowed them to break blind. And almost nobody have said that, oh, I just had like such a fantastic day or such a good experience that nothing else could explain it other than an active intervention. The other argument, which I find to be stronger and more quantitative, is that we found a study where the PANAS, the aforementioned positive and negative affection scale, was assessed on 10 consecutive days without any clinical intervention. And what was found in that study is that the mean within subject variability on the PANAS scale is about 10 points. So, the average variability of PANAS on a day-to-day basis is about 10 points, given just the ebb and flow of life. However, when we look at this table, like the difference between the placebo and the microdose, it's only about 2.2 points. So like, the microdose placebo difference is only 2 points, while the natural variability of the PANAS is about 10 points. So I'm not buying then the argument that how people grow blind is because there's such a good dates. It's only about 20% of the day-to-day variability of the PANAS, making it very, very unlikely that participants broke the blind based on noticeable health improvements. Okay, so I am about to wrap up, but just want to re-emphasize a few points. So one of them is this cell blinding methodology. And as I have mentioned before, we are very excited about this because it has some unique pros compared to both observational and clinical trials. And basically what we have figured out is how to do placebo control in the context of citizen science with high external validity. Since the study was published, unfortunately, I have wasted quite a lot of my time in contacting companies who are producing sleep supplements or cognitive enhancers, and just basically saying is that, hey, I have this cool methodology that allows to run cheap placebo-controlled trials. Do you want to team up and test your product that way? And initially, everybody is like very, very enthusiastic, but then probably they read the paper and see where this is going, and then their enthusiasm evaporates. Companies don't want to test their product. So, often they say that they don't test their product because it's very expensive to run clinical trials. We have a way of doing placebo-controlled trials in a very cheap manner, but then they still don't want to do it because for them, it's a risk factor. Important point to emphasize is that we're actually in the process of patenting cell blinding, but for academic use, we are very happy to share all of the resources. So if it's something that interests you, then please feel free to reach out and let's collaborate. So our results with respect to microdosing, I have mentioned that I think the key concept here is that of active placebo. Again, an intervention without any robust direct benefits, but that has some recognizable effects. One important limitation, however, our study is that this was in a healthy sample, and I think I've mentioned that before. And like, you know, it could be the case that microdosing is more than just an active placebo in a clinical population, so people who are like actually depressed. Actually, for all of the analysis that I have showed you, we sort of checked that in a hand-wavy manner. We took people whose baseline well-being was bottom 50% of the sample and rerun all of the analysis, and qualitatively everything remained the same. So our data is not supporting that with people who have low baseline, the effects would be different. But again, this was by and large a healthy sample that we worked in. Microdosing may be effective for some conditions, and that's just one of the limitations of what we have done. Regarding this activated expectancy bias, I think what is key, and you know, I talked about weak blinding a lot, that's one of the driving forces of this effect, that participants can deduce their treatment condition. But actually for this to work, you also need what we are calling a positive treatment expectancy. Let's say hypothetically that you have two interventions in your trial and you're equally enthusiastic about both. Then that activated expectancy effect, which is basically this arrow in this diagram, would contribute equally to the outcome. So you need that, you know, for one of the interventions, people need to be more enthusiastic, have higher expectations than for the other one. However, when we are talking about blinded studies, typically you are testing an active intervention against placebo. And I think it is fair to assume that the vast majority of participants who sign up for a clinical trial do so because they have some positive expectancy regarding the active treatment. I'm more of like a data analyst person in the group, so I don't interact with patients a lot, but I haven't heard of a single patient who signed up for these studies wanting to be in the placebo group. Of course, everybody wants to be in the active interventions. So activated expectancy bias requires these two components. The positive treatment expectancy, this is something that's rarely assessed formally, but I think there is strong reasons to believe that this is going to stand more often than not. And weak blinding is something that you can check by asking your participants to take a guess. I have mentioned previously that we have an assessment tool, which is a short questionnaire, which we think is the optimal way of asking participants to take a guess. It only has a 4+1 item, and the +1 is an optional one. So it asks you for the treatment guess. It also asks you for your confidence. And it also has some questions related to deciding whether participants are breaking blind based on noticeable health improvements or based on the side effects. So if you are interested in, you know, making this correct guess rate curves for your favorite intervention, again, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share with you the assessment tool, and let's collaborate on that. This next point, I think, is the most important one. So if you just remember like one line from this entire presentation, please let it be this one. And that is that there is a difference between trials that have a placebo control group and trials that actually control for the placebo effect. And the difference is really in the quality of the blinding. You can have a study where there is like a formal placebo control group that people are randomized into. But if the active intervention is so obvious, then that placebo control group is not going to confuse anybody. A placebo control group is only doing its job if it is genuinely confusing to people. And for many interventions, blinding is hard, and I get that, but I think we should be just clear that there is a difference here, and not all studies that have a placebo control group are controlling for the placebo effect. And this is something that you can check empirically with that treatment guess data that I have mentioned earlier. Okay, let me just see what else I wanted to tell you about. Yeah, so the correct gas rate curve, it is, as I have mentioned, in order to use this technique, you need to assess your participants for their treatment gas. We have that aforementioned assessment tool. And this paper is just coming out, but I feel we are just starting on this. This correct gas rate curve is like one particular approach in how we can integrate blinding integrity into the trial analysis, but we have some idea how to sophisticate that pipeline. So for example, as I have mentioned, in this assessment tool, the gas of treatment questionnaire, they're also asking for confidence levels, and we have some ideas how to incorporate that into the pipeline. The treatment gas, obviously, it's a complex construct. What is the patient's belief about the treatment? And we would like to get more information about that construct. And we have plans to expand the correct gas rate curve technique to make the analysis more sophisticated. Last but not the least, I have mentioned earlier in the talk that the difference between macrodosing and microdosing, and here I have mostly talked about microdosing, but notice that all of these issues around blinding and expectancy are going to be increasing exponentially with the dose, and it's even easy to argue going to become insurmountable when we talk about macrodosing. After all, it's very easy to distinguish placebo from 200 micrograms of LSD. That is just like a very, very obvious intervention. And now I think we are talking about the really interesting topics, because what I have just told you is that practically you cannot run blinded studies with psychedelic macrodosing. So we have this intervention which has a lot of hype around it, which is very exciting. And I think for good reasons, there are reasons to be optimistic about psychedelic therapy, but almost by definition, you cannot obtain the highest quality evidence for the efficacy of psychedelics, because the blinding is just not going to work. Like, yes, you might play around with active placebos or something like that, but then your correct gas rate is, it's not going to be 100%, but maybe 90%. But still, the overwhelming majority of participants are going to be unblinded, and that is just the nature of the intervention. So I think that is going to be the real challenge really moving forward, or that's what I think is really interesting, is that as psychedelic therapy moves along, how we can obtain high quality evidence, given that high quality evidence by definition, or sort of like in the traditional evidence-based medicine framework, is unobtainable for psychedelics because blinding is impossible. And I think, there is also a larger point here, and that is specifically that for most interventions, blinded studies are impossible. So blinding as a concept only works for a relatively few interventions, psychopharmacological interventions. That's when you can, give your patients a capsule that just looks like the real one, and you might be able to trick them into thinking that they are taking the active treatment. But if you're talking about a large number of interventions, and let's call them experience-based interventions, blinding as a concept doesn't work. So for example, mindfulness meditation or cognitive behavioral therapy, that the concept of blinding doesn't even work. Like, for that, what you would need is that trick people into thinking that they are meditating while actually they are riding a horse or something like that. So the point being is that, blinding only works for a small set of interventions in theory, and even for psychopharmacological interventions in practice, it doesn't work. So, I think this presents a real challenge for evidence-based medicine, is that there is such a premium on blinding, but in practice, blinding is not feasible for 99% of the interventions that we have. Or so I take back the 99%. We are working on a paper that really wants to quantify that. I don't have it ready yet, but I think it's going to be close to 99% that where it's not working. So I think, we need to revise the hierarchy of evidence and how we are looking at evidence in medicine, given that blinding when blinding is working, that's the exception, not the rule. I'm going to wrap up here. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to open up for questions. Sure, yeah.
I guess I have to use this for the Zoom people. Thank you so much. This was really, really cool. Both the data and the general claims behind it. I actually wanted to follow up a little bit, like push you a little bit more. I think you're going to agree with me, especially given where you've gone towards the end, saying that blinding working is the exception, not the rule. I was thinking about your diagram with the activated expectancy arrow, and I was thinking, what prevents us from thinking that the very same effect is going to be found at the side effects, at the level of the side effects arrow, in the sense of how people perceive side effects, both in the sense of like the acuteness of the side effects and the conviction that these are side effects of whatever they're taking, if they're taking it. Because, you know, take the microdosing thing, for example. I'm thinking people generally have expectations about how taking psychedelics should feel. And that might make them, you know, if they're actually taking the drugs, that it might mean that they actually feel a little bit more jittery. And then they link that to the fact that it must be that I'm taking the drug. Or it might be that they expect to feel jittery if they're taking the drug. And so they're paying more attention and they're interpreting whatever else is going on with them, some unrelated source of anxiety, for example, the fact that they had a coffee in the morning and they forgot about it, as signs that these are side effects of the drugs, or simply maybe just pay more attention to what's going on inside you, just because now you're in this clinical trial and you know that they're going to ask you about how you feel. And so you're going to be more prone to overanalyzing and over introspecting whatever effects you think you're experiencing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, you know, one important point is that what is an outcome and what is a side effect, that's, you know, that's not set in stone. That is depending on how you are setting up your study. So like, for example, you know, with respect to microdosing, this body load, you know, that I was talking about, that is what I'm considering a side effect. But if for any reason you want to develop a medication where body load is your target outcome, then, you know, then sort of like, let's say that, you know, microdosing does have a real effect for the sake of argument, then, you know, sort of the side effect and the outcome, you know, would swap places. And then, you know, the body load becomes the outcome, and the well-being increase becomes, you know, the side effect. Yes, what is side effect and what is treatment? That is going to be a question of your trial and what is your target outcome. And then with respect, you know, to like the self-reflection and you know, stuff like the more sensitivity towards noticing everything. Yeah, I completely agree. And that is, I think, you know, where also like, you know, citizen science is a bit of a solution, because, you know, then you are like not like, you know, it's not that, you know, you meet this like, you know, famous doctor, you know, who is going to examine, you know, and you know that you're going to have these questions. In the citizen science model, you know, I think those effects are not eliminated, but they're going to be diminished, because, you know, you're just doing your own thing, and it is it feels like, you know, a lighter intervention if you are just doing everything at home compared to like going to the hospital, meeting with so many people. Again, the effect is going to be there, but I definitely do think that citizen science offers somewhat of an answer to that problem.
Yeah, but more generally, if some drug has noticeable side effects, that should count against the very utility of trying to do a blind study in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And most drugs have side effects. Yeah. So I mean, you know, what I said at the end, that was a little bit hypothetical, and that's, you know, where I want to go to, is that like, you know, that practically there's very few interventions that can be effectively blinded. I don't claim that at the moment, but I have good feelings, you know, that let's say like, you know, 2 years down the line, I will be able to make that claim. Yeah.
Or is there people that actually use or like manufacture placebos that mimic the side effects of the drug?
Yeah, so there's the issue of like active placebos, but then, you know, the issue is that for the ideal active placebo, you would like something that has all of the side effects, but none of the direct treatment effects. But that's just super difficult, because very likely it's going to be then, you know, another drug from the same class, but then it's also going to have some treatment effects. So like, you know, I mean, yeah, active placebos in theory are a good solution to these issues, but in practice, you know, like, okay, for example, with psychedelic microdosing, what is like, you know, what is the active, what is a good active placebo? And then, you know, it is There is none, and that's very, very typical. So yeah, I like active placebos as a concept, but it, like, just like blinding is an awesome concept, and I definitely do think that it has like good there's good thinking behind it. It's come from a good place, like from methodologically. I think you know what I want to say, but the point is that, but if blinding doesn't work in practice, you have to find some alternative that does work in practice. And I feel similarly about active placebos, is that, yeah, sounds cool in theory, but if it doesn't work in practice, then we have to find something that does work in practice. That's how I look at it. Welcome. Right.
So I have a question. So when did you assess the blinding? Was it like after each ingestion? Because they do it for 4 weeks, right? Once for the
So it was basically when you see these, it was always at these. It was always the last question.
For each participant, you had 4 data points.
Yes.
So I was thinking like an alternative way to try to account for this. Maybe some people get it correct 4 times out of 4, and then you could just use that as.
Sorry, say that again. I didn't catch it.
Maybe the correct guess rate for some participants might be 4 out of 4. And so this would indicate that they have like good introspection, or like interception. I don't know what the correct term is, but like they have a.
Yeah, sensitive, or yeah.
Well, ideally, the ideal guessing participant should be 2 out of 4 in this. So because, yeah, I was thinking that could be an alternative way to account for lack of blinding.
Yeah, well, then the issue is that then you're like throwing away so much of your data. It's like there's going to be a few people who are going to be 2 out of 4. Like with this curve technique, like we use all the data that we have. I mean, I hear what you say, but if we would do it that way, that's a possible analysis. But then you throw away a lot of data, so it's wasteful in that sense. But it could be tried. Yeah.
I don't know. So it's really most of the data is not going to be within like the 1, 2, 3 out of 4 range.
I mean, I don't know from the top of my head, like for what's going to be the exact percentage, but I think that would be low. Yeah.
Because I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the experience of the participants was, but maybe some people have just more experience with it, so they are better able to tell what was the placebo, what wasn't.
So generally, like in this trial, like practically everybody had some prior experiences with psychedelics, and that is just coming again from the nature of these citizen science approaches. I mean, there were very few people who were walking around and never had anything to do with psychedelics or microdosing, and then heard about these studies that yes, I can do with placebo control. Now I'm going to start taking psychedelics. No, people who came into this study were people who already had psychedelic experiences. I mean, if nothing else, they needed to have access to psychedelics because, as I said earlier in the talk, they needed to source their own drugs. So in the sense, this is a biased sample because it is with non-naive participants. And actually, it's like a cool little thing that I just recently realized. So remember I said that one of the driving forces of this activated expectancy is that people need to have much higher expectations for the active drug condition compared to the placebo, right? And then, so there is it's not our study, but there was another study from London-based university. This one, the first author is Yanakieva. Probably I'm not pronouncing it well, but that's the only microdose trial that have used basically non-college students as participants. It was with elderly adults who were psychedelic naive the past 5 years. So they could have taken some, back in the day, but past 5 years psychedelic naive, and I think it was for people above 60. And one of the drug conditions in that study was 20 micrograms of LSD. And one of the items was good drug effect, VES between 0 and 100. So this visual analog scale with the slider. And in that sample, 20 micrograms of LSD, good drug effect, average value 10. And then a year later, another study came out from the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands, who also had a 20 micrograms LSD condition, but they used college students. So people who, sort of like it is a reasonable assumption that we have much higher expectations for psychedelics. And they actually say it in the paper that most of them had prior psychedelic experience. And in that study, they also had a good drug effect VS. So same dose, same drug, same measure. But with the college students, the average value was 40. So again, it was 10, with the elderly people. So there was like a 4 times larger effect in the college kids compared to the elderly people. So that is just like one example of how this non-naive population is going to bias the results, and that's certainly present in our trial as well. It would be cool, to recruit people, naive people, for a study like this, but that's just practically very, very difficult. You're welcome. Sure.
So also, let's say like in your hypothetical sample, you have 70% correct guess rate. Then when you split into 2 groups, one of 70 and one of 30, isn't there still a bias in the sense that if you're guessing, like if you're in a group which like the 30% that guessed wrong, like you were definitely guessing, but if you're in the group that got it correct, you could have been guessing, or you could have been basing it on something.
Yeah, so we like, remember when I talked about the assessment tool towards the end, I mentioned is that like one of the questions is going to be like the confidence in your guess, because that allows you to distinguish people who just got it right by chance, people who have low confidence in their guess, and people who got it right because they have noticed the effect. And yeah, there's going to be a self-blinding microdose study 2.0 launching later this year, and that's going to have this confidence question that is going to allow us to basically respond to that question. But yeah, good point. And yeah, ask me in a year's time, and I'll have some data to show. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah.